Good afternoon, and welcome to the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation's Meet the Scientists monthly webinar series. I'm Dr. Jeff Borenstein, President and CEO of the Foundation, and your host for today's webinar. Today, Dr. Michael Berk will present Prevention of Depression. The Brain and Behavior Research Foundation is committed to alleviating the suffering caused by mental illness by awarding grants that will lead to advances and breakthroughs in scientific research. The Foundation is the largest private funder of mental health research grants. Since 1987, the Foundation has awarded more than $360 million to more than 5,000 grants to more than 4,000 scientists around the world. 100% of all donor contributions for research are invested in our grants to scientists who are working to find breakthroughs in disorders such as ADHD, anxiety, autism, bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder, depression, OCD, post-traumatic stress, addiction, and schizophrenia. I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Michael Berk. Dr. Berk is Director and Alfred Deakin Professor of Psychiatry at the Deakin University School of Medicine in Australia. He leads the Impact Strategic Research Center at Deakin and is also an honorary professorial fellow at the Florey Institute of Neuroscience and Mental Health at Oregon's National Center of Excellence in Youth Mental Health at Melbourne University. Dr. Berk is the 2015 recipient of the Foundation's Colvin Prize for Outstanding Achievement in Mood Disorders. Today's webinar will begin with Dr. Berk's presentation. This will be followed by a question and answer period. To submit your questions, please use the Questions tab on the control panel on your screen. Please feel free to submit your questions throughout the presentation. Following the presentation, I'll present your questions to Dr. Berk and we'll address as many as possible in the time allotted. And now, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Michael Berk. Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jeff. It's fabulous to be able to talk to you about the issue of the prevention of depression. This is something that I'm very interested and committed about, and it's an area that our unit has had an extended interest in trying to understand. As backgrounds, psychiatry has not really had a very good idea about how to prevent depression. We treat them. We have some idea about how to treat depression, but we really don't have a good idea about how to prevent depression. I'm just having some issues with my computer here.
If you can just click on the slide directly. Just click on the slide.
Okay, right.
Perfect.
Right, so in terms of the burden of disability, we know that psychiatric disorders are the largest component of the burden of disability in developed societies. Of these, depression is by far the largest problem that we have. The great difficulty that we have is that we don't really know how to treat depression terribly well, in that a large number of people with depression remain symptomatic, even with the best treatments we have. And so being able to prevent depression would be a massive advantage and to the field. So where do we all want to end up here? We want to end up in happy streets. But then the question is, how do we get there? This is much more complicated than we would like it to be. Sorry, I'm just struggling with the slide advance thing here.
Just click again on the slide. Just click on the slide, and it should advance.
Right. So one of the great issues that we have is that we've got some evidence that the incidence of depression amongst the population actually seems to be increasing. This is a real problem. So we've got some a number of really important studies. Here's one by Jean Twenge from California, and she's run studies where she's used the same measure of depression and hypomania for many years. And over a period of 5 or 6 decades, they found a slow but steady increase in measures of both depression and hypomania amongst college students. This is an area, if this is true, this is of great concern. There's some more recent papers that have been published. So this is a paper that's derived from a 12-month prevalence of major depression in surveys in the United States, and has seen an increase in the prevalence of depression, both in young adults as well as in adolescents. This is a really worrying issue from a public health point of view. And it's been picked up by a number of major news organizations. So this is from one of my favorite magazines, The Economist. And it talks about the increase in the number of sufferers of depression, as well as the massive costs that go together with this increased burden of disease. This is probably not only true of developed countries, but there's some evidence from Taiwan that this is also the case there, that the prevalence of depression is increasing. Now, if this is the case, this begs a very important question: why? Because it does imply that there are some plastic environmental factors that are driving depression. And what I'm going to be doing in this presentation is really highlighting those. But before we do that, I want to just highlight some work done by Gavin Andrews, where he looked at what percentage of the burden of disease at a population level can be averted by optimal treatment. And he modeled that in depression, it's probably just over 20%. So we could get rid of about 20% of the burden of disease if everyone had optimal treatment. And we know that that's not actually the case. So one of the things that has actually happened, which is a quite worrying mirror to the data I've shown you, is that in many studies, the prevalence of use of treatments is going up at a population level. So this is data from Australia, but it very much mirrors what we see in the United States. A very large increase in the prevalence of antidepressant use from about 3.5% to about 19% of the population in Australia. Very high rates of use. But the important thing to note is that this is not associated with an improvement in population mental health. So why? So let's look at some of the factors that might be driving this. The first I'm going to look at is economic factors. So there's been a very steady increase in incomes in the United States over the past half a century plus. But this has not been paralleled by an increase in personal happiness. So money's gone up, happiness hasn't, suggesting that money on itself is not a particularly useful driver. What has changed, though, is values and attitudes have changed quite a lot. So if you look at this figure, by Jean Twenge, 12th graders in the United States are much less likely to see work as a central part of their lives and willing to do work to do the best possible job. But the expectations of what they'd like to have are much increased. So they much more want to own a new car every 2 to 3 years. They want to have a recreational vehicle, a vacation house. That's increased a lot. So expectations are a big issue. The other thing that's changed is interpersonal factors and the way that we relate. And again, probably the standout, and it links to what I said before in terms of expectations, is measures of narcissism have gone up. So if you look at measures of narcissism using inventory scores over a period of a number of decades, people have become much more narcissistic. We are a society of me, not a society of we. And this is a Western phenomenon throughout the world. So as an example, if you look at American students who rate their abilities as above average, in terms of their drive to achieve, their self-confidence, their leadership ability, this has gone up steadily. We now have an entire nation of people who are above average, which you and I know mathematically is not possible. And the problem is, if you expect to be special at everything, that's not the message that life gives you, and that's a source of unhappiness. The other thing that's really changed very dramatically over the past few decades is social isolation. We have become a much more nuclear and isolated society. So if you look at data about the time that people spend socializing with friends, at a national level, this has dropped dramatically. We are sitting on our own, alone, on Facebook, but we're not seeing people, we're not talking to people, we're lonely. This is a massive change. And, you know, people are now going from meeting and having tea and socializing to social media. And the question becomes, is social media a useful substitute for face-to-face social contact? And this data says no. There's a number of studies that have looked at this. I'm just showing you one, which looks at the relationship between self-report of depression and media usage. And for the most part, the people who are the most unhappy are the same people as the ones who are using large amounts of social media. All right, so what about vitamin D? Why vitamin D, you might ask? Well, the first reason is that there's a pretty good evidence that people with mental health problems have low levels of vitamin D. So here's some really good evidence from a very large Norwegian study that looked prospectively at levels of vitamin D and your risk for going on to develop depression. And what you can see here is that those people who have the lowest levels of vitamin D have the highest risks of going on to develop the first episode of depression. This is worrying data. The question is, what does it mean and where is this coming from? The same is true in schizophrenia. So work by John McGrath and colleagues. This is a fantastic study. He got hold of the blood spots that people give at birth. So at birth, you get a heel prick blood which gets stored, and he found a way 20 years later to measure vitamin D in stored heel prick and look at your risk of developing schizophrenia. And you can see that on the left-hand side of the chart, the people who have the lowest levels of vitamin D have a much higher risk of going on to developing schizophrenia. So this seems to be true across psychiatric disorders. Then the question becomes, well, that's easy. Low vitamin D leads to depression. Surely that's easy to fix. Let's give people vitamin D. So we thought, simple problem, simple solution. Let's do it. So we ran a clinical trial where we took 2,500 people in the community and we gave them vitamin D. So the first slide I want to show you is what does vitamin D do to their vitamin D levels. And you can see the dark bars, which are the people who are getting vitamin D, are much higher than the people in the light bars who are getting placebo. So vitamin D increases vitamin D levels, but does it increase depression? Not a bit. So you can see that the blue bars, which are the placebo, and the red bars, which are the vitamin D, they're sitting right on top of each other. There's just no impact at all of vitamin D on well-being. So this whole story has become much more complicated. And now the whole field has moved to think that vitamin D is probably a consequence of depression, not a cause of it. So if you are indoors, you're not seeing the sun, you're not physically active, you're not doing anything, you're more likely to have low vitamin D, and those factors might be driving it. But what seemed to be a simple solution, let's give vitamin D, let's fix depression, that didn't turn out to be that way. Well, what about diet? There have been massive changes in diet over the past half century. Both in low and middle income countries and in high income countries, we have gone away from eating the kind of foods that you buy in markets to the kind of foods that you buy in supermarkets, from meat and fish and chicken and veg to packaged foods, soft drinks, processed foods. This is a massive change at a global level. So again, this is data from The Economist, which looks at the consumption of fresh green vegetables and ready meals and convenience products. And there's been a massive decline in the consumption of fresh green vegetables and an increase in ready meals, pizzas, crisps, and sundry junk foods. So does this make a difference? Well, the first data was from my colleague Felice Jacker, who published this paper in the American Journal of Psychiatry showing an association between Western and traditional diets with depression and anxiety, and we saw the same in bipolar disorder. And the bottom line is that if you are eating junk food, you're much more likely to be depressed. And if you're eating healthy food, you're much more likely to be happy. But that's cross-sectional data. The important thing is longitudinal. Does it predict change over time? And I think the best study is this study called the MOBA study. It's the mother-baby study. It's a fabulous study that was done in Norway, where they took 25,000 mother-baby pairs, looked at mum's diet while she was pregnant, and the baby's diet while as an infant at a number of time points, 18 months, 36 months, 5 years. And they looked at, did mum's diet and the baby's early diet influence the child's risk of having a mental health problem? And the answer is, yes, it does. Essentially, those people who were eating the poor quality diet, both mum when she was pregnant with you and you in your early lives, you had a higher risk of developing depression and anxiety symptoms. The other thing that we now know is that there's some data that eating junk food might actually be shrinking your brain. So we, again, Felice Jacker did this study where she did a 4-year follow-up study of people eating a good diet, an average diet, and a poor quality diet. And she was able to show that the part of the brain called the hippocampus, which is probably the part of the brain that's most affected when you're depressed, is damaged in people who have a poor quality diet and relatively preserved in people who have a better quality diet. And this was true over a 4-year period of follow-up. So diet seems to be very important for brain health. One of the questions is, if you take supplements, can you turn junk food into healthy food? And sadly, the evidence seems to be really no. Firstly, there's no magic nutrient that we think equates that you can reduce all good diet down to folic acid or omega-3 or any other nutrient of your choice. And secondly, unhealthy diet has an awful lot of stuff that's bad for you in it. Excess sugar, excess fat, excess salt. So bad diet is not only toxic in itself, but healthy diet has many ingredients that you need. So then the question becomes, if you change your diet, does this change your risk of developing mental health? And a fabulous study was done called the PREDIMED study. It was originally done for cardiovascular disease to prevent heart attacks. But the study was big enough and they were able to look at whether people became depressed. And what they found was that in this very large prevention study, people who took a Mediterranean diet had a lower risk of developing depression. So if you look at this table here, compared to controls, the people who had a Mediterranean diet and extra virgin olive oil had a risk of 0.71, so they had only 71% chance of developing depression. If you had a Mediterranean diet with extra nuts, you had an odds ratio of 0.59, which is just under half the chance, just over half the chance of developing depression. So this is a very important study, and it's for the first time suggests that changing your diet might be enough to reduce your risk of developing depression. But the degree of adherence to the diet was not large. The control group also received diet advice, and many people already had Mediterranean diet at baseline. The question that we all ask ourselves, though, is what about individual foods? And I put this in really more for fun than for hard science. But there's studies that have looked at coffee consumption and risk of depression. And the good news for all of us coffee addicts is that there seems to be a J-shaped curve that if you have moderate amounts of coffee, your risk of developing depression is decreased. If you're having very large amounts of coffee, you seem to have an increased risk of developing depression. But moderate amounts of coffee consumption probably is good for you. So I've stolen this slide from Damien Hirst, contemporary British artists, to kind of illustrate that we may well be in a position where food can start to be considered as medicine. And the first study that has actually shown this is a study, again, run by Felice Jacker in my group, called the SMILES trial. So it's the first clinical trial that aimed to treat depression with diet. So what we did in this randomized control trial was we randomized people to either dietetic support or social support. They either saw a dietitian or they saw a psychologist. And what we found at the end of the 3-month period is that the participants who had the dietary intervention had a far more robust reduction in depressive symptoms than people who saw the psychologist who got social support. This was a very surprising finding from our point of view, and again, a very encouraging one that definitely needs to be replicated. The other thing that we saw was actually a reduction in health service costs. So the people in the diet group actually saved money, despite the fact that they were eating a healthier diet, and this was driven by lower health service utilization. So that's diet, and diet certainly looks promising. What about physical activity? Well, we know that physical activity works for depression. It really does. And certainly as a clinician, I have little to no doubt that people who engage in physical activity benefit. So there's a huge number of studies in this meta-analysis. So you can see the diamond is very far to the right of the straight line, which favors exercise. So if you add all the studies together that have looked at physical activity as a treatment for depression, it sure does work. What about the association between diet and new episodes of depression? In other words, if you're physically active, does this prevent depression? So I'm just going to focus on this. This is physical activity divided into very low, low, moderate, or high. And you can see that the more you exercise, the lower your risk of depression. And this is a beautiful where you're looking at previous habitual physical activity or current physical activity. Physical activity really does predict depression. We also know that physical activity in childhood predicts adult depression. So even if you adjust for adult levels of physical activity, if you are physically active as a kid, you have a 1.5 times smaller risk of developing depression than if you're not physically active. So your kids need to play sport. And the same is true in the elderly. So if we look at physical activity and risk for depression and anxiety in older men and women, the same is true. So if you look at cases of depression, the low physical activity group seem to have a much greater probability of being depressed than the 5 physical activity group. So I think we really have something here to hang on to. So what about prevention? And the best data is actually in the area of perinatal depression. So they looked at exercise in mums as a prevention for postnatal depression. And what they found in this meta-analysis, when you add all the studies together, that the diamond is to the left of the line, which favors exercise, so that if you are exercising when you're pregnant, you have a much lower risk of becoming depressed when your baby arrives. So that's another useful message. What about smoking? Now, we kind of take for granted that many people with mental health smoke, and it's so much part of the landscape that people tend to pay no attention to this. But it's my view that that is a grave mistake, because smoking is one of the low-hanging fruit areas in terms of both the treatment and prevention of depression. So we did one of the earliest studies looking at whether smoking alters your risk of developing depression. So in this study, we followed a cohort of women over a period of a decade, and we compared non-smokers to smokers. And we looked at who's at greater risk of developing a first episode of depression, who's going to remain free of major depression. And you can see the smokers are much more likely to develop an episode of depression than the non-smokers. So this was a very important finding. We now know from meta-analytic studies that smoking is a risk factor for Alzheimer's disease as well. It's not only for depression, but it's true of dementia. Interestingly, in this meta-analysis, they looked at whether the studies had tobacco industry support, and only the studies that had no tobacco industry support showed problems. Surprises there, anybody? And the same is true of psychosis. So if you're a smoker, you're at much greater risk of going on to develop a first psychotic episode. So smoking seems to be really bad for your mental health. So we did a study, again in the Norwegian mother-baby study, where we looked at pregnancy, smoking in pregnancy, whether it predicts later mental health problems in the children. So if you smoke when you're pregnant with your baby, does that influence your risk of your baby becoming depressed? And what we found is that smoking in pregnancy was associated with more anxiety when the offspring were 18 months. We saw more anxiety behaviors with higher rates of smoking. So the more you smoke, the more likely your kids were to be anxious. And it seems that smoking during the first trimester of pregnancy was the critical period. And this is absolutely what you'd expect with everything we know about fetal development. So we need to go into the antenatal clinics and make damn sure that mums don't smoke. The other thing that we now know is that smokers have thinner brains than non-smokers. So this is a very important paper published in Molecular Psychiatry 18 months ago, where they looked at brain thickness comparing current smokers, ex-smokers, and never smokers. And this is very important for two reasons. Firstly, you can see current smokers have thinner brains, but ex-smokers recovered to the point that they were pretty much comparable with never smokers. So this is very much a message of hope. If you quit, your brain will recover. And the most important slide about smoking is this one. One of the uncertainties that people ask is, well, if you stop smoking, you're going to feel really crabby. Surely it's not, you might as well just carry on smoking. Well, the answer is no. So we know that if you smoke, you have an earlier age of onset of psychiatric problems. You have a poorer response to treatment. So if you are depressed and you smoke, you're much less likely to respond to treatment. You're going to be more severe. You're going to have more suicidality. If you look at cigarette smoking, it's one of the most potent predictors of suicidality. But the essence of this evidence, which I want to show you, is that if you quit smoking, your mental health improves. So your mental the take-home message of this study is very clearly published in the British Medical Journal a couple of years ago. Was if you want to improve your mental health, one of the most useful things you can do is quit smoking. Let me briefly talk about some other weird stuff. Dental health. We've published some data showing that if you have poor dental health, you have a much greater risk of having mood symptoms. This might sound like a weird thing to look at. And the reason why we looked at it is following our interest in inflammation. The most common source of inflammation in the Western world is dental caries and gum disease. It's the most common chronic inflammatory disorder because we know that chronic inflammation is a risk factor for depression. And we know that all the things that we've spoken about, poor diet, smoking, physical inactivity, increase inflammation. So maybe one of the most useful things you can do for your mental health is to floss. There's a really interesting paper published at the end of last year on air pollution and psychiatric disorders. And they suggested that in people who have exposed to both nitric oxide, which comes out of cars, and PM10, which are very small particles in the air, that if that those areas that have the worst air pollution have the highest rates of psychiatric problems. Really weird stuff, plastic surgery. So if you think you're not pretty enough, will your mental health improve? Well, if you have plastic surgery, well, the study looked at two things. Well, firstly, did other people think you were more pretty after you had plastic surgery? And the answer is no, they didn't. So objectively rated attractiveness scores didn't change after plastic surgery, but also happiness didn't. And the last weird thing I want to talk about is sleep. There's been massive changes in sleep over the past few decades. As we've become more wired as a society, we are sleeping much less. So the percentage of people in the US who are sleeping less than 6 hours a day has increased quite dramatically. And we know that insomnia and insufficient sleep is a risk factor for a huge variety of problems. So insomnia more than doubles your risk of developing depression and anxiety. It increases your risk of having fibromyalgia or ME, and many other medical disorders from rheumatoid arthritis to headaches, asthma, and heart attacks. To get back to the theme of inflammation, we know that if you don't sleep enough, you have more inflammation. One of the things that happens when you sleep is that much of the immune repair and much of the work that your body's immune system does to protect you against ill health occurs during sleep. And so you have more inflammation that occurs when you don't sleep enough. So let me just summarize where we're at. And I want to pull this together, a paper that was published just a couple of weeks ago where they looked at what's causing depression. Is it the environment? Is it genetics? Or is it shared factors? So here you can see genetic factors play a role, but common environmental factors and unique environmental factors are far and away the most important drivers, particularly in childhood. So we really need to look at these environmental factors. So what are the things that might help? So one of the first and best preventive strategies, which was published again in JAMA, which is one of the premier medical journals, they used a web-based self-help intervention for young adults who had subthreshold depression. So if you took this cohort of youngsters who had some depressive symptoms and you looked at can you prevent them becoming properly depressed, the kids who had the intervention seemed to have a lower risk of going on to develop proper depression than those who didn't. So maybe web-based approaches are really useful. And I'm going to finish off talking about inflammation. So we know that all the things that I've spoken about and some that I didn't have time to speak about, so diet, exercise, substance abuse, vitamin D, obesity, stress, allergies, leaky gut, all of these things translate to inflammation in the brain. And we know, for example, that poor quality diet increases your risk of inflammation. So there's a thing called an inflammatory diet pattern, which is the same thing as a junk food diet. And we know that the worse your diet, so if you look at a very poor quality diet here in quintile 5, so the top quartile, top fifth in terms of worst diet, they have much higher levels of inflammation than the people who have the healthiest diets. So these are looking at a number of markers of inflammation. And for all of these markers, the worse the diet, the more inflammation you've got floating around your body. So can we do anything about this inflammation in terms of medication? So we published this paper at the end of last year looking that if you took anti-inflammatory drugs like statins or aspirin, you had a lower risk of developing depression. Now, we've replicated this in a number of studies, and we've been able to show that people who take statins or people who take aspirin, which are usually given for risk of heart disease, seems to lower your risk of developing depression. And we're just in the process of completing this study, which is, I think this really in many ways is a landmark study, which we're doing together with partners at Monash University. It's called the ASPRI study, and ASPRI stands for Aspirin in the Prevention of Events in the Elderly. So what this study is studying the effect of aspirin on the healthy lifespan. So it's looking at, does aspirin alter your risk of developing a range of chronic disorders from heart disease, stroke, cancer, diabetes. But we were able to persuade them to do an add-on study to see if does aspirin prevent depression. So it's a randomized controlled trial. We've got 19,118 healthy participants throughout the United States and Australia, randomized to either getting low-dose aspirin or placebo, and they're going to be followed up for 5 years. So we're now, everyone's been recruited, and we're now in year 3 of the follow-up phase. And this study will be able to tell us, can taking an aspirin a day reduce your risk of developing depression? Now, we know that almost 10% of this group were depressed based on symptom scores at the start of the study. And so this study will also be able to tell us whether aspirin can treat depression. So it's a very exciting study. The size of the study and its scope for me is very exciting. Just to emphasize, we have no preventive treatments for depression medicine-wise. So this will, if this study is positive, it will define the very first medication that might prevent depression. So let me summarize and tie this all together by looking at the risk factors for anxiety and depression across the life scores. So we know that there are a number of social determinants of mental health. So these are the factors like social isolation. They're protective lifestyle factors. These include sleep, healthy diet, and physical activity. And it's clear that these lifestyle factors are very potent and they operate across the lifespan. So good sleep, healthy diet, physical activity, not smoking, this is highly protective throughout your life. If you look at adversity, and I really haven't spoken much about adversity here, childhood trauma is a very toxic factor. Intimate partner violence, family conflict, job strain, they are clearly risk factors, although the prevention of childhood trauma is a vexed and complex issue. We also know that having a supportive community and social environment, and particularly having very dense, well-connected social networks, is strongly protective. Being able to attain your educational goal and working in a healthy workplace is protective, and having social and emotional skills is strongly protective. So we want to get beyond the idea that we can just find a ticket to happiness and that there's a pill that's going to fix these problems. We need to look at this much more broadly, and we need to be looking at a variety of lifestyle factors and environmental factors. I think probably the most important message to take home about this is one of empowerment. In other words, many of the factors that are important in terms of the risk of depression are in the control of you and I. We can watch what we eat. We can go to gym. We can go for a bicycle ride. We can make a decision to quit smoking. We can pick up the phone and go and see a friend for a cup of coffee rather than posting something on Facebook. Many of the things that are capable of giving us better mental health we can do. What we need to do, though, is be much more proactive in getting the message out there that this is something that we can control, this is something that we can achieve, and we really can make a contribution not only to our own mental health, but by getting this message out there to population mental health. So I'm going to stop at this point, and I'd be very happy to take any questions that anybody has.
Great, great. Michael, thank you very much for the work that you've done and continue to do, and for just an excellent presentation. And I think that one of the key points that you're making is that just as we've moved towards prevention in other areas of our health, whether it be heart disease or other conditions, we're now looking to move to prevention for mental health. And I think that is extremely, extremely important. So I want to ask you to speak a little bit more about the role of inflammation and how that does affect the brain and how that can result in depression, anxiety, etc.
Absolutely. But before I talk about inflammation, I just want to really emphasize a point that you've made earlier about prevention. So if you look at heart disease, the mortality rates for heart disease have come down dramatically at a population level. If you've had a heart attack, you're not doing any better now than you did 40 years ago. We're not much better at reversing the damage once you've had a heart attack. Same is true of cancer. Once you've got cancer and it's spread, we're no better really at treating late-stage cancer than we were 20, 30 years ago. Late-stage disseminated cancer is still the death sentence that it was. It's probably fair to say that at a population level, all the major gains in heart disease have been through blood pressure screening, through cholesterol control, and smoking programs. And the same is true of cancer. It's through breast screening programs. It's through having pap smears. That's how we've defeated cancer. It's all been in the prevention, public health. We really don't have a cure for cancer yet. And mental health has been really poor at emphasizing prevention. So I completely agree with Jeff that this really is the next frontier for mental health. So to talk about inflammation, inflammation is the body's defense against intrusion. So these would be viruses and bacteria, but it's also true that this is a response against all manner of stresses. So if you are psychologically stressed, your levels of inflammation go up. So it's a non-specific defense system. The problem is that inflammation defends you against bacteria and stresses in the short term when the bug's around. But if you have an overactivated immune system, this is quite damaging to your health in general. So an overactivated immune system is associated with risk for mental health problems, and it's also associated with the risk for a number of other common medical disorders, including heart disease, diabetes, for example. So there's huge interest in the mental health sphere for the potential of anti-inflammatory therapies. So you can go about this two ways. The way that most people are going about it is by using treatments like aspirin, like statins, there's some antibodies that knock out components of the immune system, and people are looking at those as treatments for a variety of psychiatric disorders. Drugs as simple as COX inhibitors, which are anti-inflammatory agents that people use for arthritis, for example, seem to have potential for mental health, for a number of mental health problems. And I think it's fair to say that it's one of the more promising leads that we have in the whole mental health arena. But we don't want to get around the fact that you can lower your inflammation just by moving from a junk food diet to a healthy diet. That's enough. If you stop smoking, your inflammation goes down. Lowering psychological stress lowers inflammation. Being fit as opposed to sedentary lowers your levels of inflammation. So we can go about addressing inflammation by using medication, but if you or I take control of our lifestyle, that in and of itself reduces inflammation. So in a sense, immunology has moved in psychiatry from a peripheral, unrelated discipline to very much core of the discipline now, and I think pretty much everybody's looking at this as an element of why things are doing what they're doing.
I think a very important point, and in terms of the issue of inflammation and immune response, etc. In many ways, the steps that people can take in their own life or in their kids' life are very similar to the steps that people take to prevent heart disease, and that in many ways, trying to prevent heart disease could help prevent brain disease such as depression and anxiety. So it seems like that's one of the key points you're making.
Absolutely. So there really are, these are common determinants. So the same things that increase your risk of heart disease, increase your risk of mental health disease, increase your risk of diabetes, and the same thing that will prevent dementia and heart disease will prevent depression. The body is not siloed. These things all tend to go together.
In the work looking at exercise, physical activity, is there sort of a basic rule of thumb that, this is the minimum amount that we want people at, whether it be as children or adults or more elderly people, is there an amount and a type of exercise that you can recommend?
That is a very, very important point. And a lot of people have the misperception that you have to do triathlons in order to benefit from exercise, and this is absolutely not the case. The evidence suggests that exercise is beneficial to an extent. The more you do, the better. But even at relatively modest amounts of exercise, you derive benefit. So you certainly do not have to do triathlons. Just taking your dog for a half-an-hour walk every morning is clearly beneficial. So moderate and modest amounts of exercise are essential, are necessary. In terms of amount, probably about 3 times a week would be the amount that seems to be required. So you certainly don't need to be pumping iron for 3 hours every day. If you take your dog for a walk 3 times a week and you're not doing it now, that'll improve your mental and physical health.
So really, people should, a little bit is good, even more is better, but don't let the idea that you're not doing a triathlon block you from doing anything whatsoever.
Absolutely. And the evidence probably suggests that if you were taking your dog for a walk for an hour every day or a half an hour every day, that is much better than doing nothing. And then the step to doing triathlons is actually a smaller step. So it's much more important that you do something compared to nothing than you do a lot compared to a little. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah. The starting to do something really is the big step forward. Similar to stopping smoking is a big step forward for somebody.
That is a very big step forward.
Yeah. There's a couple of questions asking about sleep, similar to the exercise. You spoke about the increased percentage of people sleeping less than 6 hours a night. And I know there's a range, but what would you say is the appropriate range that people should be aiming to sleep in order to reduce the risk?
Well, people vary in terms of their sleep requirement. And some people can happily sleep 6 hours a night, and that's all they need, and they feel refreshed with that. But that's a minority. So the 8 hours will probably be around the mean, so somewhere between 7 to 9. And people who habitually sleep very little or people who habitually sleep an awful lot seem to be at greater risk of developing problems. So most people's sleep requirement is in the 8 range. Somewhere between 7 to 9 would probably be a sensible target to aim for. But many people try and burn the candle at both ends. I just want to watch that extra program or send off those extra emails, and then you get waking up early to commute to work, and that's really harmful for your health. The other point to make, particularly in terms of mood disorders and sleep, is that it's not just quantity, it's regularity. It's really important to have a very regular day-night cycle. So going to bed at the same time and waking up at the same time is very important. Probably waking up at the same time is more important than what time you go to sleep. But for mental health, particularly in disorders like bipolar disorder, trying to be fairly disciplined around waking up at the same time every morning is a significant contributor towards mental health.
But that's very helpful. A couple of people are asking about the very interesting work, the study that you're doing with aspirin. And people are curious, although it's only year 3, are there any preliminary results from this that you're able to speak about?
No, it's all blind data, so we have no idea yet. I wish we did.
Okay, so you're not right. So you're not at a point where you can say, based upon this study, people should or shouldn't do that intervention.
No,
that's not.
We can't say anything yet. So what we can say is the epidemiology data suggests that people who take aspirin and statins and medicines like that seem to have lower risks of developing depression. But one would never make a clinical recommendation based on those kinds of association studies because there are many confounds that can do it. People who might be more worried about their health might be more likely to take aspirin to prevent heart attacks, but they might be the people who are exercising more and not smoking anyway. So there are many other things that can drive those studies, and so we don't like making recommendations based on epidemiology studies, association studies, because there's potential noise in that.
Right. Can you tell us a little bit more about the web-based self-help study in terms of people maybe having some early slight signs of depression and then reducing the risk of it developing into a full-blown depression?
Well, the whole area of web-based therapies is a very exciting one, and I mean, we've known for a long time that psychotherapies are helpful. That's not new. The problem with psychotherapies is that they're expensive. It's hard to access a therapist, especially if your health coverage isn't great, or if you're living in a rural or regional area, then accessing psychotherapy is hard. And so the web-based approaches seem to be very promising. And there are a number of studies that have looked at taking treatments like CBT, which are very manualized and very easy to turn into a protocol, and putting them on the web. And some of them, like Panic Online and Mood Gym, for depression and panic disorder, and the one that we're developing, which is called Mood Swings for bipolar disorder, seem to be very promising. We've just completed a study called Mood Swings together with Stanford, and we've seen an improvements in depression as well as a reduction in health costs. So we looked at health service utilization and showed a reduction in costs in people who use these programs. So they really seem to have a lot of promise. And people have taken these therapies and offered them to people who have emerging mild to moderate depression. Particularly, they've looked at young people, college students and school students, and offered them these programs. In a way, they're not strict. I think it's also important to kind of say there's more than one prevention. So there's what we call primary prevention, where at a population level, you do an intervention. So, for example, you tax cigarettes to stop people smoking, and that's something that's applicable to the whole community. And obviously, you can't give CBT to the whole population, but this is more what we call indicated prevention. In other words, you select a group of people based on risk. For example, people who have mild depressive symptoms, you give them a treatment like cognitive behavior therapy online and see if this helps. So it's somewhere between early treatment and true prevention. It's kind of a hybrid of the two. But nevertheless, if we can offer internet-based therapies to a large number of people who have mild symptoms of depression, and if this truly does prevent them developing more significant symptoms of depression, that would be very valuable from a public health perspective.
Yeah, it would make a tremendous difference, and prevention of somebody at high risk certainly can make a big difference for many, many people. What should, if a person who's listening right now has a child, adolescent, college age child, who is showing some of those early signs, maybe above and beyond what might normally occur in an adolescent, with more anxiety, moodiness. What should a parent do in the context of everything that you've described today?
Well, the first thing to do is not to ignore it. But the great difficulties for parents is it's very hard to often initiate a communication because people withdraw, and they often find it difficult to communicate the extent of their distress. So just opening up a non-judgmental, open communication. How are you? How are you doing? You seem a bit stressed today. Is everything okay? Is there anything I can do to help? So just opening up a non-judgmental, non-critical communication with the person is very helpful. If it's clear that the person really is struggling, you probably want to get them help sooner rather than later. And again, every system has its own access points, but primary care would be a good place to start to access care. And seeing a psychologist for some counseling or some psychotherapy might be really helpful. Or if the problem is more significant, then one might have to go through conventional treatment. But then also emphasizing the lifestyle factors is very important. Young people kind of don't like being lectured to, and there's often pushback against being told stuff. So it's sometimes better to kind of share information and help them to make their own choice about whether they want to do something about it. So you can say, look, I've done some reading, and these are the things that seem to help. So if you're eating a healthier diet, if you don't smoke, if you're physically active, that seems to help. Very important to usually start with one small, easily attainable goal rather than to try and take on the world. So it's often helpful to pick on one, to say, okay, can you take the dog for a walk this morning? Let's go and take the dog for a walk this morning. You pick one goal that's small and attainable, and you build on there. But the other thing that's really important is also to, in a sense, normalize it. I mean, these are common problems, and many, many people go through it, and the young person may well have a sense of being alone and unique in their suffering. And just to know that there are many other people out there that have the same thing, some people find helpful. The sense that they're not alone is sometimes very helpful for young people who are struggling with these problems. Again, there's often a bit of social withdrawal in people who are depressed, and this is often normal for depression. But to the extent that the young person is able to agree to it or tolerate it, just increasing the amount of support around them from people who care, and that could be family members, it could be from friends, is often also helpful. Again, the key is not to bully the person into it and to make them feel coerced or criticized for what they're not doing, but just encourage and support it to do what is helpful. And as far as possible, to do it in such a way that the young person has the sense that they are making the decisions to help themselves rather than they're being dictated to, is often helpful.
Very, I think, useful advice to anybody who's a parent. So thank you. I thought that was, just very well said. I appreciate that. One last question, and that has to do with the use of marijuana, which many places are moving towards legalization in the United States. How does that fit into this picture?
Well, again, marijuana for me is quite a worrying thing. So we know that marijuana use is a very clear risk factor for mental health problems, and this risk is much greater in young people. So people who start smoking marijuana in their teens are at much greater risk of developing a host of mental health problems, particularly psychotic symptoms. So your risk of developing psychosis is doubled if you're using marijuana. That your risk of developing mood disorders, and particularly panic anxiety, is increased by marijuana. And there's some evidence that it is to some extent a gateway drug to other agents. So I have significant concerns about the move to legalization, especially if legalization is going to be done commercially, such that firms will be competing with each other to market the drugs and to make sure that they are selling the most potent form of the drug, because there's going to be selective breeding programs so that the people will make claims that my drug's more potent than yours. So I don't think that the public health implications of this are really well worked out, and the way that it is legalized and the way it's disseminated is going to make a big difference to risks. But I think that it's an open. It's also true that there's huge rates of marijuana use now, even though it's illicit. That's also absolutely the case. And whether legalization is going to make it worse is uncertain. So, for example, legalization in Holland wasn't associated with a significant increase in marijuana use in young people. So a lot of this is going to depend on how it's done, so how well it's controlled, what impact marketing and branding is going to have. Because once you start marketing and branding marijuana to kids, we know how receptive kids are to this. TV ads for marijuana are not implausible. given First Amendment rights of the manufacturers. So this is going to be a very vexed and complex issue, and whether this is rolled out with a commercial imperative in mind or a public health imperative in mind is going to really determine a significant amount of the impact. But I think we're in unknown territory with unknown, potentially real risks.
Thank you. I think that's again very well stated and an important issue as we look towards prevention on a population and an individualized basis. Michael, I want to thank you so much for a very interesting and extremely informative presentation. Also want to thank you for all the work that you have done and continue to do to improve the lives of so many people. So thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. And I want to thank you and the BBRF for the amazing contribution that you make to mental health on a global level. You really are the leading philanthropic player in the field, and your contributions have made a massive difference to mental health globally. So thank you.
Thank you. It's a privilege for our foundation to have such an extraordinary collaboration between generous donors and extraordinary scientists. So thank you. I also want to thank everybody for participating in today's webinar. All of the research that we fund is made possible through private donations, and I hope that you'll consider making a gift. Please visit our website at bbrfoundation.org or call us at 1-800-829-8289. This webinar has been recorded. If you've missed any portion of the presentation or would like to share it with a family member or friend, please visit the webinar page at our website. And to see the future webinar programming schedule, again, please go to our website. Once again, thank you for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of the day. Take care.
Thank you.